Welcome to the session on the discussion of the philosophical topic hermeneutics. And to discuss this interesting topic with us today, we have two experts in the studio. On to my left is Dr. Keith D'Souza, teaches at St. Pius College, Mumbai since 1989. Has a long inning of teaching career behind him. He did his doctorate in Marquette University, United States, on the topic of philosophical hermeneutics, the writings of Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur. He has several articles to his credit. He has also edited books, and he certainly has long experience of teaching this important topic. And we look forward to his interesting ideas and understanding of hermeneutics. And on to my right is Dr. Ivo Coelho, who teaches at Divyadayan Institute of Philosophy at Nasik. He also has over 20 years of teaching experience. He's done a doctorate in hermeneutics on the writings of Lonergan, and he has edited a book on Brahman and the person, the writings of Richard Desmith, a famous philosopher who has been teaching in Pune Institute for several years. He's also the editor of Divyadayan, a journal of philosophy published from his own institute. So we have two experts today with us to let us know about the important topic hermeneutics. Let me begin with Dr. Keith D'Souza, and I'm going to ask him, what is the meaning of hermeneutics? And how do we understand this technical term? For most of us, it remains a technical term, therefore I'm sure he'll be able to explain to us in a better way. Dr. Keith, tell us, what do you understand by hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics is indeed a technical term. It comes from a Greek word, hermenoin. And hermenoin means, that itself comes from Hermes. Hermes was a Greek god. And the responsibility of this Greek god Hermes was to explain the message of the gods to human beings, because very often the message of the gods is very dense, it's opaque, it's not transparent. And even till today, if you want scripture to be explained, you ask a pandit or you ask a scholar to explain the intricacies of the text. So hermeneutics has, if you want to define that term, it simply means a theory of interpretation. That's a very simple definition of hermeneutics. If you want a little more specific definition, it is the theory of the interpretation of texts. If you want a more technical definition, it is the study of the operations of the understanding as they apply to the interpretation of texts. Understanding is used for various disciplines, scientific disciplines, ethics, deciding about the future, what goes on in the mind when texts are read and understood.
Okay, Dr. Keith, this is a theory of interpretation of texts. And who are the main proponents of this theory? Because we have a long history of hermeneutical theories, and I would want Dr. Ivo to enlighten us. Who are the key figures who propagated this theory of interpretation?
The word hermeneutics probably originated in the 17th century, but naturally there is a longer history before that. The art of interpretation is very ancient. It probably originated with the effort to interpret religious texts. Religious people reading their texts might have come across things that were embarrassing or things that were not clear, and so the effort to find a way of explaining these texts or casting light on these obscurities. In India, we have, of course, great traditions of interpretation. I am thinking at present especially of Purva Mimamsa, which was the effort to interpret the Vedic texts with an interest especially in ritual action. And then we have Uttara Mimamsa, more popularly known as Vedanta, which is the effort to interpret the same Vedic texts and the Vedanta, but now with an interest in the sayings that lead to liberation, the sayings that reveal knowledge of Brahman. In our own country, perhaps hermeneutics did not take quite the turn that it took in the West, where at some point it became an independent discipline with its own physiognomy, But perhaps on this matter, Dr. D'Souza might cast more light.
Yes, Dr. D'Souza, tell us more about some of the Western thinkers who really worked on this theory of hermeneutics or theory of interpretation.
Hermeneutics has come into its own light from the late 18th century, early 19th century, and you may say the father of contemporary hermeneutics is Swayamprabha, German Swayamprabha. His contribution was to integrate the different regional or specific areas of hermeneutics. There were three main areas: scripture, legal texts, law, and literature. And there was interpretation in all these three fields. How do you arrive at good translations, first of all these legal texts, literary texts, commentaries, which commentary is more authoritative, which provides a better interpretation. What Swayamprabha did was to not only integrate all these into a general theory of interpretation, but to elevate interpretation to a philosophical discipline. So while epistemology deals with truth, epistemology is a very well established philosophical discipline. Hermeneutics deals with meaning, and there is always a struggle between these two. Those who are more rationalistically minded, more empirically minded, they would like to establish the veracity, the specificity, the objectivity of true claims. Whereas those who take into account pluralism, which is very much our contemporary situation, would give more importance to hermeneutics, which stresses meaning. Whether the meaning is implied to religion, whether it's implied to ideologies, different ways nations, cultures understand themselves, etc. Now there is a whole list of thinkers. Swayamprabha, that was his contribution. He gave importance to the two aspects: the personal or the psychological contribution of the author, which a good interpretation would determine what is the intention of the author, and what he called the grammatical, which is the historical, social, literary context. After him came Dilthey. Dilthey's great contribution was to see how history and historical influences are instrumental in forming consciousness, in forming texts. Today we take these things for granted. We know that texts that are produced are not really ideal texts, but produced on the basis of a certain historical forces, certain cultural forces that are constraining the creation of these texts. Dilthey also gave importance to Erlebnis, or the living experience, and that was influential with the whole existential school. And Heidegger gave importance to how texts need to be personally appropriated, how life itself is an interpretation, how what we call interpretation is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole iceberg below, which is what he called the force structure of understanding, which enables us to understand life and texts. And there are two more thinkers. There is Gadamer, who is a disciple of Heidegger, who concretized Heidegger's philosophy and said, what is the foundation for interpretation is our tradition. Each one is rooted in a certain tradition, and that tradition it influences whatever interpretation we come out with. And finally, Ricoeur allowed for a little distance between the original event, which was converted into a text. Not everything, as you know, which was an event can be reduced to a text. And how is a text understood? There's a distance between that. There's a distance also between us and the original intention of the author. Gadamer and Ricoeur were not interested in finding out what was the original intention of the author in the construction of a text. Even if the author is not there, or even if the author is there, we can still appropriate that meaning in a different way.
Okay, Dr. D'Souza, you have been trying to tell us that when you read a text, you also need to take the historicity into account. The semantics is understood from the point of view of the author, etc., etc. I would like to know a little more from Dr. Ivo, that what is before you is a text. How do we understand? How can I get into the mind of the author who is no more before me? All that is before me is a text. What criteria should I apply to understand the text? Because there can be many interpretations of the same text, and which interpretation is really true?
Perhaps one way of putting this would be to talk in terms of understanding, explanation, and application. Understanding would be the contribution of people like Heidegger and Gadamer, for example. Heidegger made us aware that understanding is not just something we do with texts, it is something we are as human beings. And Gadamer, as Dr. D'Souza tried to highlight, took this and focused on understanding as a means to reach the meaning of the text. And what I like about Gadamer is that he made us aware that it is not just that we possess a tradition, we are a tradition. Our historicity is our being, or as Lonergan would put it, meaning is a constitutive part of our being. And so this meaning that I am helps me in approaching the meaning of the text. It is not that the less I know, the better I will be able to understand a text. It is the more I know and the more I have appropriated what I am, that I will be able to understand the text. So that would be the area of understanding. People like Gadamer are not very comfortable with methods of interpretation, but I was delighted to know that Ricoeur has sort of given an honorable place once again to methods, because Lonergan also is a person who is very much associated with the word method. So what are the methods, possible methods of interpretation? There are the form critical methods, internal and external structure. You could ask about internal sources, you could ask about external sources of the author, you could ask about the history of the redaction of the text, you could ask about various attempts at interpretation of this text, you could ask about lexicology, you could apply metaphorology. These would be examples of what Ricoeur would call explanation. And then finally there's application, which is sometimes understood slightly differently by different people. I think in a very simple way, application would be, what does this text say to me in my situation, or what does it say to us today? What kind of meanings does it yield for our context today? But people like Adam might say, unless we have a question, the text will not open up, it will not light up. So the question is something that lights up the text. In that sense, he's talking about application.
Okay, Dr. Ivo, you've been saying that, meaning is something to be appropriated, understood. But, when you look at phenomenologists, they would say that meaning is a construct. I give a meaning to a reality, I give a meaning to a text when I read the way I understand and so on. When it comes to mythology, for example, we can pass it on as a history sometimes. There are attempts from some quarters we find in our own country where myth is considered to be a history, and that is taken as historically true. Now, I think it becomes very important for us to understand from the point of view of hermeneutics, this kind of tension that is going on between mythology and history. How do you differentiate these two? Can you tell us, Dr. D'Souza, a little more about it?
Sure. There are many schools of interpretation, and how you answer your question will depend on which school you subscribe to. But I think if you want a very comprehensive interpretation, you would have to take into account both understanding and explanation. If you only talk about constructivism, phenomenology, you may be along the lines of just constructing a text and not subjecting the text to critical scrutiny. So in explanation, you would have to use rigorous methods of textual study, comparative methods, asking, I think, also including the mind of the author, what did the author intend, and what were the historical, cultural conditions that led to the construction of this text. That links up with the critical hermeneutics, because the questions that we ask are sometimes biased depending on the culture to which we belong, to the nation to which we belong, to the region, to the language that we speak. And we are not in the best position to be aware of our biases. Perhaps others can tell us, see, these are your biases, that is why this text has been constructed. Suppose, for example, we read a text which is written 2,500 years ago, 1,500 years ago, in which there is slavery, where there is gender discrimination and other types of discrimination. With our contemporary horizon of meaning, we would find it difficult to simply replicate that text and the meaning that the text evokes today. It would be considered unjust. So critical hermeneutics challenges us, I think, to raise critical questions. Who has constructed the text? What is perhaps a hidden agenda in the construction of the text? Which parties will gain by the construction of the text? Is there a class struggle? Is there a caste struggle? Is there a nationalistic nation international struggle? Who constructs text? Why do they construct? All these types of questions critical hermeneutics raises. To some extent, hermeneutics has to be complemented by deconstruction, because sometimes deconstruction is useful because it lays bare power inequalities, relations of inequality, which perhaps hermeneutics has not focused on so much. That is why Ricoeur takes the best of the hermeneutical tradition and allows for Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, who is from the critical theory school, to raise these type of questions. When I make a claim or when I make an interpretation, it has to be meaningful. It has to be true, objectively true. That means I get the best resources that I have to come out with a claim, which can be challenged in an open court. It has to be truthful. I am not going to deceive people. I don't have any conscious hidden agenda. And finally, it has to be ethically appropriate. That means not only what I am saying has to be without biases, without certain conscious biases, but it has to be, my communication should be done in a manner that is respectful towards the other person. It's a very comprehensive criteria Habermas puts forward.
I think that certainly explains very well, how hermeneutics, particularly critical hermeneutics, can be put into very good use in understanding historical text and so on. But I would like to ask Dr. Ivo, how deconstruction as well as the postmodernist trends that we find today are related to hermeneutics. There is certainly a link, as Dr. D'Souza rightly said. Maybe Dr. Ivo can put a little more light on this.
Perhaps I'm not the best person to ask about deconstruction, but what I understand is that deconstruction would be one more element in the strategy of suspicion. It would make us sharply aware, for example, that there are polarities in any text, in any situation, power polarities, power inequalities, and so in that sense it would help us to move in the direction of truth. But of course deconstructionists would not like to use these kind of categories, I think. So that is the extent of my familiarity with deconstructionism.
Yeah, please.
May I add to that? You had raised a question about the differentiation between myth and history. There are different narrative forms, and of these different narrative forms there is myth, there is history, and there is basic fiction. And one has to delineate the differentiation between these. There is a blurring sometimes, but if one is a scholar, for example, one is expected to know what has more mythological foundation, which is more useful in faith, in belief, in spirituality, in religion. But history has to be open to a wider audience in order to judge its veracity. Fiction, one has more creative license, and sometimes there is a blurring of the distinction, and this causes problems. With regard to deconstruction, deconstruction points out that sometimes the grand narrative, the larger narratives, or the larger community story about itself may attempt to subsume smaller narratives, smaller communities. And there's a process of not only wanting to dominate in terms of telling a story that you want others to accept with all its values, but even the ones who are dominated sometimes want to come up, want to be socially mobile, upwardly mobile, and want to assume those narrative identities.
They are very rightly said. But at the same time, you also find there are conflicts between truth claims, be it in the realm of religion, in the realm of ethics, the realm of social life, and so on. And you often find these truth claims generate conflicts in the social life too. How we can perhaps usefully apply the theory of hermeneutics or theory of interpretation to understand the truth claims, and how we can find certain consensus. Dr. D'Souza?
I think here the criteria that Habermas puts forward are useful. Appel and Habermas. Those 4 criteria. Any communication should idealistically conform to 4 criteria. Whatever I am putting across should be meaningful. First of all, we should establish the meaningfulness of the claim that I am putting forward, or the story that I am writing. Clarify if you don't understand with one whom you are having a conversation with. The second one is truth, and here it means that when I make a claim, a serious claim, I am saying that what I am saying is true objectively. Maybe 100 years down the line it may prove to be false, but according to our current perspective, this is what appears to me the truth. And if you have got better argumentation, if you have got better evidence, then I should be happy to look forward to that argumentation and evidence, rather than be defensive and want to hold on to my claim. Here is where truth is a beautiful platform upon which the whole human family can meet. That's a beautiful criterion there. Truthfulness, that is a psychological, subjective, ethical personal condition is also important. That when I'm communicating, I'm not attempting to mislead you. I'm not playing games here. I'm being serious. And the fourth criterion of being ethically appropriate is also important, which not only means in how I communicate, but also the structures, the social structures that have given rise to communication and that give rise to interpretation. Those structures should, as far as possible, be more just, be more transparent, in which different people who have different power relations are able to express themselves and say what interpretation affects them negatively.
I think the question of meaning is very important in the sense meaning is always conditioned by one's own social cultural environment, one's own historical and religious traditions and so on. How can we understand a little more deeper this whole question of meaning from the Lonergan's point of view? Dr. Ivo, you can tell us a little more about that?
Well, as far as meaning is concerned, I think without claiming a mutual influence, what we have said about Gadamer and Heidegger would be very much acceptable to a person like Lonergan, because he would talk about meaning as constitutive of our being human. So being human is not just a question of having this much body mass and this kind of color, this kind of height. Meaning is very much part of what I am. My history is me in a very special way, in a very real way. And Gadamer has that beautiful aphorism that historically effective consciousness is more being than consciousness. That would be very much what Lonergan talks about in terms of meaning as constitutive of my reality.
Okay, so therefore its meaning is part of my being, that is constituted of my own being. Now, this being is actually lived out in a concrete socio-historical context. And that's where we have problems, And how are we able to find consensus in certain social contexts? Dr. D'Souza would be able to tell us a little more, because applying this theory of interpretation, we need to find a way forward, particularly in a heterogeneous society or a multi-religious and multicultural society. How can we find a certain amount of consensus, which I think we are all struggling with?
If I know the answer to that question, I would be given the Nobel Peace Prize. But I can at least indicate a direction in which we can move towards, arriving at a mutual understanding. If one does not play games, if one is open and honest and transparent and says, this is the tradition I'm coming from, and these are the weaknesses of my tradition, but these are the strengths of my tradition, and I am ready to listen to you, provided you also are honest and say, this is the tradition I'm coming from, and happy and proud to belong to this tradition, to this religion, to this faith. What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of that? How can we overcome these? How can we create a new human family in which we are not searching for one sort of homogeneous way of being human, because that would be so dull. Each one can contribute to the human family by retaining certain cultural identities. Whether it is religion, whether it is dress, whether it is food and other things, provided we are able to also be critical enough to look at our own traditions and say, let us overcome these dysfunctional elements in our tradition. If we live in an ideal world, we can also be openly critical about other people's traditions, but we don't live in an ideal world, so sometimes we are hoping that the intellectuals, those who are more enlightened in different traditions, are able to be self-critical, are able to be critical of their traditions, because it is very difficult to criticize another person's tradition, another person's nation, another person's religion. But ideally, and this is where I think philosophy and hermeneutics is important, is that we must develop self-criticism so that we can criticize ourselves, so that we can grow as better persons, criticize our communities. There is a hermeneutics of belonging, of trust, what is called hermeneutics of trust. There is also hermeneutics of suspicion. There must be moments of suspicion where we call into question unhealthy practices, habits, attitudes, patterns, structures, etc. and return again. That's the hermeneutical circle. We start by trusting our tradition, and then with education we come to know there are certain things that are not so good. That is the hermeneutics of suspicion. But we come back. Most of us don't abandon our tradition so easily. unless there is some intellectual revolution that goes on in our minds. That also happens. That is very rare, but it is not always necessary.
I think that's very well said. Self-criticism is important. Criticism of one's own tradition, one's own culture, and so on. Only that will take us to more refined path. To Dr. I would like to ask one more question. That is, apply this theory of hermeneutics or theory of interpretation to our education system today in India. I think it's an area which needs to be a little more addressed, because the kind of pedagogy that we follow in this country and the kind of consequences that gives rise to perhaps not entirely satisfactory. Can we think of a way in which we can better apply the hermeneutical principles to education system in India?
Perhaps before I come to that, I would just like to continue with the question that Dr. D'Souza was trying to answer, a little short of the Nobel Prize if you want. I think when we get together and try to reach mutual understanding, we take for granted that there is a desire for mutual understanding. And in that sense, we must recall Aristotle's great reminder that friendship is a condition for philosophy. I would say friendship is very much a condition for understanding. If we have no desire to understand, then we have stopped before we can begin. If there is a desire to understand, there is still the whole work of coming to self-knowledge, gaining self-criticism, becoming transparent to ourselves in the sense of making our own traditions, where we are coming from, our own cultural backgrounds as transparent as possible. So that friendship as a condition for understanding, I would say, is a very, very important condition. How can we do that? Of course, is another large area. But here is where I think philosophy interfaces with spirituality, with personal growth, with psychology, and so on and so forth. And perhaps some of these things will also spill over into the question that you have asked me about education. And I think all the things that we've been saying about the need for a certain measure of suspicion, the need for self-criticism, the need for self-knowledge, these are things that we would have to bring into our education process, and perhaps insist that education is not just a question of learning by rote and spitting out answers onto an examination paper or in a viva or whatever it is. So the importance of helping our youth, helping students to discover that they have inbuilt principles of criticism, and that they can learn very much from a discipline like hermeneutics.
I think that's very well said. Today's education system requires more critical approach. Very often when we hear the term criticism, it has a negative connotation. But I think when it is applied in academics, particularly in philosophy, it has a very positive connotation, meaning to say there's a critical inquiry into a particular subject, particular tradition, or whatever, which is very positive in its understanding and approach. I think from that point of view, we can move forward, perhaps reforming our current education system, which will be more critical inquiry oriented. There are a few questions from the part of the audience to the speakers.
Though in the beginning everything looked very strange to me because too academic and too many names, but towards the end I was extremely happy, especially when D'Souza pointed out that each one will have to first accept that he belongs to a tradition, and then in mutual trust he should be able to also have a sense of suspicion and thereby criticize one's own tradition and come back again with greater enrichment. And all the more I was happy when I was said that friendship is the basis. Now perhaps Aristotle said about friendship in a personal level, but in a national level, the different communities, the different races, if only we can develop that patriotic sense with which we will be able to apply all those four criteria: belonging, trust, suspicion, and then come back to build up a good nation, that would be wonderful. I think I am very much enriched by your interventions.
Thank you, professors, for this enlightening session. While speaking, Professor Ivo was referring to the starting point of hermeneutics to religious traditions and interpretation of religious text. Could you enlighten us a little more in this regard, either Professor D'Souza or Professor Ivo? How this hermeneutics is related to religious interpretation, religious text, and philosophical interpretation.
Maybe I could begin. From what I am aware, a person called Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish person, was the first one to talk about allegoresis, the theory of allegory, and he was studying the Jewish biblical texts. He borrowed that theory from a group of philosophers called the Stoics, and he was the one who said when there are obscure passages, we must search not for the meaning that is most obvious, but for a meaning that is hidden. We have to go behind the text to find the hidden meaning, which would be the real meaning. This theory itself was taken up by a Christian person called Origen, who is considered one of the great theologians of the early church, and he called it the theory of typology. And there he would say things that the Old Testament say in a hidden way are made more manifest in the New Testament. But I think that same process of allegory is to be found in the process of interpreting religious texts anywhere in the world. In our own country, for example, we will have texts about Krishna and the gopis, and a person interpreting them will ask, but what does that mean? Is it just a relationship between a man and a woman, or is there a deeper spiritual meaning to it? And that would be an example of how allegoresis is present also in texts like, let's say, of an Indian religion.
I would like to complement what Dr. Coelho has said. When you are reading especially a religious text as a believer, a religious text generally is very beautiful, literary rich, and something that it is profitably to pray with. But when you are looking at a religious text as a scholar, one must employ a little distanciation. What Ricoeur uses, distanciation. Without that distanciation, you will not be able to look critically at a text and to see where it is coming from, whether the values that the text have been created by are still values that we can uphold today. And here is where different forms of discrimination might also be in religious texts. Now, that is not to say that we must do away with religious texts, but how do we make sense of them today? How can we focus on the positive and understand that the negative dimensions of those texts had a past historical basis, which may not be our basis today? So we can understand that and focus more on the positive, healthy aspects of religious texts. And here's where scholarship could perhaps help. Good scholarship will use good exegetical methods, good historical critical methods.
So, my dear people, I am Tadayus, coming from Kotagiri, philosophy teacher. The issue of introducing philosophy to this curriculum also to enhance the students, the future students, for critical analysis and so on. Even in our circle, certain times there is a criticism of philosophy is mere mental cerebration. In that case, critical hermeneutics, how will it help the students, maybe after BA and MA philosophy and so on, how will they be helped to reread the ethos of time, cultural milieu? Perhaps we have also pseudo communications in either fields like theatre, art and literature and so on. The students of BA and MA philosophy, what would be they made to work at it? Perhaps what will be the contribution after the studies?
Perhaps one thing that comes to my mind is that we help our students become aware of their own situatedness, their own culture, their own history, their own personal history and geography. That would be very much part of understanding or self-knowledge, and becoming aware of ourselves, bringing our historicity to light, which is an endless task in many ways. This is itself a critical task. The more I become aware, the less I will be governed by perhaps negative factors in my own historicity and situatedness. So that would certainly be one very important task for our students, becoming aware of themselves and of their own historicity.
I would like to add not only education, especially distance learning, can bring in dimensions which may not be there in a closed system, in a system where the teacher gives the answers to the students. Swayamprabha spoke about becoming aware of the original, the inspiration, according to which a text has been formulated. So, a critical student will ask, who has written this text? Whatever text I am reading, where is it coming from? Dilthey will ask, what are the historical conditions that have led to the construction of this text? Heidegger will ask, how can I make this text a part of my being rather than only study for the exam? How can I assimilate and appropriate this text, make it part of my life? Gadamer will say, how can I appreciate the traditional background and effort that have gone into the construction of these texts, so we can be more appreciative of different texts that come from different traditions. Ricoeur and Habermas will pay more importance to specifically the critical dimension, to raise questions like, what are the strengths of this text? What are the weaknesses of this text? How does this text compare to other texts?
That is, from quantity to quality. It takes place almost in the most modern era. There is also a person I learned some time back who was having a meaning, man searching for meaning in the dungeon, the prison. Now, what is the criteria of the concept of meaning? How shall we inculcate in the mind of students, particularly in the IGNOU level?
If I understand you right, you are referring to Viktor Frankl's famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. There he would be asking perhaps a more specific question. The question, do you have a reason for which to live, a reason for which to die? And he was trying to say that people survived in the concentration camp only if they had a powerful reason for living. That would be perhaps part of what we are talking about, but then again it might be slightly different also.
I think if I may add to what he has been asking about the meaning, to a certain extent meaning is also transmitted to each one of us by our own religious tradition, our social tradition, our political tradition or economic tradition. We all have meaningfulness to live by. Now, having shared the transmitted meaningfulness, one also goes through the process of discovering it for himself or herself. I think when that integration takes place in the right proportion, I think that makes sense for the person to go this way or that way, to accept this position or that position. I think ultimately it is a personalized choice one has to make. Of course, keeping in mind the larger social context, one has to probably align with the social requirement and social needs of the day. I think this healthy tension will always continue between the personalized as well as the social requirements.
What do you suggest can be done for the practical application of philosophy to the solution of some of the students and youth problems that we face in India today? The gap is there, and I think it should be addressed. What do you suggest can be done?
Maybe I should add something that we have not highlighted enough in the discussion today, and that is that there is a group process also. If any single one of us can approach truth in a small way, 5 of us sitting together in an atmosphere of friendship, in an atmosphere of peace, can come to a better chance of approaching understanding and truth.
We have had a very lively discussion on the very interesting topic of hermeneutics, how this applies to historical texts, to religious texts, and many other texts that we are familiar with. And we all try to understand the meaning that is there, the hidden meaning, and how we can understand the mind of the author, how we can appropriate the meaning, etc., from the point of view of a number of thinkers, both Western and Indian. And I want to wholeheartedly thank both participants of today's discussion, Dr. Keith D'Souza as well as Dr. Ivan Coelho, who have been very, shall I say, erudite in the presentation of their views. And I'm sure all of us have benefited from their sharing, their insights, their learning, and so on. I think we must continue this process of learning with a critical view with a critical inquiry, with a critical mind, so that we can unravel the mysteries of truth that are presented to us every day in different forms. Thank you very much for participating in this. Thank you very much.
Other as much as clinically feasible. Slight deviations from parallelism, approximately 10 to 15 degrees, can be taken up by the attachment mechanisms. However, it is best that we have ideal parallelisms, and therefore planning and proper surgical execution has to be done. There are certain tips to follow that, how to use paralleling pins, the drills, do sequential drilling, and that will be discussed in the next sessions. What is important is that what planning we did clinically, what we did radiographically, also is translated to the surgical site, and therefore the same duplicated denture can be used as a surgical stent, albeit with a little modification. Now we have to make it suit to the surgical site, therefore we have to trim the labial and the lingual flanges so that it does not interfere with the reflected mucoperiosteal flap during the surgery. And based on the planning which we have done, we have to mark the selected site. Right? Generally, suppose it is for this patient, it is lingual to the canine. So we know where our initial osteotomy punch cut will lie, and therefore we can have a proper placement of the implant. Secondly, these stents have to be disinfected prior to surgery. Now with this, I am concluding this session of planning for the implant and tissue supported overdenture in the mandible, with implants placed in the B and D sector, with an overview of the different overdenture designs and the prosthesis mobilities which are possible. And now when you go to your second clinical sessions, wherein the counselors will discuss these things in detail and demonstrate on patients also, a workup for a patient, you will understand it much better. Any questions, you please feel free to ask right now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abhinav, for the presentation, and I think it has been really well understood and imbibed, since we didn't have any questions. So I feel that they have really understood it very well. So anyway, I think it will be there to see when they have the examinations. So I really thank all of you for having come for the teleconferencing and attended the same, and I also thank Dr. Abhinav for having spared his time and explained everything so I think in so much of detail and so meticulously, which I think should really, if you have